History whispers a timeless story: empires rise, empires fall. From ancient times to the modern era, the world has witnessed the rise and fall of great powers that once ruled continents and oceans. Every empire, no matter how strong, eventually bows to the law of nature. Nothing lasts forever. From Rome to the Ottomans, great civilizations crumbled under their own weight. Their grandeur once shook the world, but in the end, internal weaknesses, corruption, and division became the main causes of their downfall. History proves that when empires forget their origins and the value of justice, they slowly head towards destruction. Surah Ar-Rum, the 30th chapter of the Quran, reminds us that dominance is temporary. How many unjust cities have we destroyed and caused other people to succeed them? This verse is not just a reminder, but also a lesson that power is a trust, not an absolute right. Every nation that forgets justice and oppresses its people will surely be replaced by those more deserving. Today, the question revolves around the future of the United States. The country that was once a symbol of strength and progress now faces increasingly complex challenges. Many wonder, will America repeat the fate of previous empires? Once the world's superpower, America now faces internal and external pressures. Economic crises, social inequality, and political divisions are worsening. In addition, challenges from new powers like China and India add pressure to America's position on the world stage. Economic concerns, political polarization, and the rise of new global powers cloud its future. America is now at a crossroads. Can it fix its internal weaknesses, or will it become another entry in the history of fallen empires? The Roman and Byzantine empires, once invincible, fell due to internal decay and external threats. They failed to adapt to changing times, and in the end, history wrote their names as a lesson for future generations. The lessons of history and the wisdom of Surah Ar-Rum encourage us to face uncomfortable realities and seek solutions rooted in justice and acknowledge the temporary nature of power. Only by understanding history and learning from it can we build a more just and sustainable future so as not to repeat the same mistakes. The United States, long considered a symbol of strength and stability in the world, is now showing cracks in its foundation. Behind the image of grandeur and strong institutions, there are deep-seated problems that are becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Political divisions and extreme partisanship have poisoned public discourse, causing the people to split into two camps that are difficult to reconcile. Every issue, big or small, often becomes a battleground for intense ideological conflict. In this environment, compromise is a rarity. Elected officials prioritize party victory over national interest, causing many important policies to fail. This political deadlock prevents the government from addressing critical issues such as healthcare, education, and climate change. As a result, public trust in government institutions is eroding, and frustration is growing among the people. Economically, the United States national debt continues to soar, exceeding trillions of dollars and burdening future generations. Every year, the budget deficit grows, raising concerns about the country's economic future. At the same time, the gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a select few elites, while many ordinary citizens struggle to meet their basic needs. This inequality fuels resentment, street protests, and sometimes social unrest that is difficult to control. Many feel that the American dream is becoming increasingly elusive. On the international stage, America's global dominance is being challenged by new powers, especially China, which is becoming increasingly bold in demonstrating its economic and military might. China's rapid growth in technology, trade, and military is reshaping the global geopolitical landscape, forcing America to reassess its role. Other countries like Russia and India are also becoming more active in vying for influence on the international stage, adding to the challenges to American dominance. All of this is leading to a more multipolar world, where power and influence are no longer concentrated in the hands of a single nation. The United States now faces significant challenges in maintaining its position as a world leader. Quote, Total Collapse of America in 2045 Justification Introduction to Fall Scenarios. Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30, describes the cycle of power through the defeat and victory of the Byzantine Empire, 30:1-6, emphasizing that worldly power is temporary and dependent on justice and faith in Allah. This analysis examines the possibility of the total collapse of the United States by 2045, referencing patterns of empire decline such as the Roman, Byzantine, and considering contemporary US challenges such as polarization, debt, and geopolitical competition. Taking an honest approach, this section provides justification based on Ibn Kathir's interpretation, historical sources, economic data, and sentiment on Platform X, while questioning the narrative of the decline of the US and connecting it to the themes of Surah Ar-Rum. Historical pattern and context of Surah Ar-Rum, the Byzantine Empire referred to in Surah Ar-Rum, fell in 1453 CE due to external conflict, Ottoman conquest, internal decline, corruption, religious schism, and economic inequality, heavy taxation, as documented by John Haldon. This pattern was repeated in the Ottoman Empire, collapsed in 1922 due to European debt, and the British Empire declined after 1947 due to the costs of colonialism. Surah Ar-Rum 34:5 warns that empires that neglect justice will face decline, a lesson relevant to predicting the fate of the United States. The US in 2025 shows similar signs of decline. Political polarization. 80% of people see the country as divided, according to the Pew Research Center. A $34 trillion national debt, 120% of GDP, and competition with China. Trump's policies, such as a 10% tariff on imports, could reduce global GDP by 0.8%, according to the IMF, accelerating the loss of US influence. If this trend continues through 2045, total collapse, that is, the loss of economic, military, and cultural superpower status, is a possibility worth considering. Justification of total collapse in 2045. Economic decline and usury. The usury-based financial system contributes to inequality in the US, with 1% of the population owning 32% of the wealth, according to the Federal Reserve. The 2008 crisis, fueled by speculative lending, caused global losses of $10 trillion, according to the IMF. Without reform, the debt burden and inequality could trigger a worse economic crisis by 2045, similar to the Byzantine decline caused by heavy taxation. Surah Ar-Rum suggests that inequality, such as that fueled by usury, is contrary to divine justice, accelerating the decline. Social and political polarization. US polarization, with 60% of ex-users in April 2025 expressing concerns about social division, mirrors the Byzantine schism. Incidents like the death of George Floyd, 2020, have exposed issues of racism and inequality, increasing social tensions. By 2045, if left unresolved, this polarization could weaken institutions, as happened in ancient empires. Geopolitical competition and de-dollarization. The US faces challenges from China and the BRICS, which are promoting de-dollarization, according to Tom McTague in The Atlantic. Allies such as Saudi Arabia and France are beginning to turn away from the US, with China mediating Saudi-Iranian relations. By 2045, if the dollar loses its reserve currency status, US economic influence could decline, similar to the loss of Constantinople as the center of Byzantine trade. Trade war and recession. Trump's protectionist policies, such as tariffs on China and Canada, triggered a stock market crash in March 2025, with the Nasdaq down 4%. If the trade war continues, supply chain disruptions could cause a global recession, weakening the US by 2045. This parallels the Byzantines' failure to adapt to Venetian competition. Other countries' progress. Forecasts such as the Gold Indonesia Vision 2045 show that countries like Indonesia will become the world's fourth or fifth largest economy, with a per capita income of $23,000, $30,300, according to Bappenas. The growth of China and India could also reduce US dominance, mirroring the power shift in Surah Ar-Rum after the fall of Byzantine. The fall narrative question. Narratives about the fall of the US are often polar. Some portray the US as remaining dominant, while others predict imminent collapse. This honest approach questions both. While challenges such as debt and polarization are serious, the US has military advantages, $886 billion defense budget, and technological innovation. Total collapse by 2045 would require systemic failures in addressing inequality and conflict, but reforms such as investment in education or diplomacy could avert it. Surah Ar-Rum emphasizes that justice and faith are the keys to resilience, lessons that the US can learn from. Implications for the Islamic world. The Muslim world, including Malaysia, can take advantage of the relative decline of the US to lead through Islamic finance and unity. Malaysia, with 40% of its banking assets being Sharia compliant, can promote alternatives to usury, according to Bank Negara Malaysia. Through the OIC, the Muslim world can address global issues such as climate change, in line with the message of Surah Ar-Rum about victory through justice. Conclusion: the total collapse of the US by 2045 is a possibility if inequality, polarization, and geopolitical competition are not addressed, mirroring the pattern of Roman Byzantine decline. Justifications include the burden of usury, trade wars, and the progress of other countries such as Indonesia. Surah Ar-Rum reminds us that power depends on justice, offering lessons for the US and the Muslim world. This honest analysis highlights the need for inclusive global reform, learning from history and the Quran, tariff policy and trade dynamics. Introduction to Trump's tariff framework. On the 2nd of April 2025, US President Donald Trump announced a broad-based retaliatory tariff policy, imposing a 10% base tariff on all imports effective the 5th of April 2025, with country-specific rates based on alleged trade imbalances. Malaysia was hit with a 24% tariff, lower than neighboring countries such as Vietnam, 46%, and Cambodia, 49%, but still significant for an export-oriented economy. Trump justified these tariffs as a response to alleged high tariffs imposed by trading partners, claiming that Malaysia's average tariff rate on US goods was 47%. However, Malaysia's Ministry of Trade and Industry, MITI, refuted these claims, stating that the actual tariff rate applied was about 5.6%, in line with World Trade Organization (WTO) commitments. This discrepancy highlights the challenges in assessing the validity of tariffs and their economic rationale. On April 10, 2025, Trump announced a 90-day hold on most tariffs, citing the potential for a fair deal. The hold provided temporary relief but prolonged uncertainty, as businesses and governments awaited clarity on long-term trade terms. The tariffs and their hold have sparked debate about the economic impact on Malaysia, a country where exports to the US accounted for 13.2% of total exports in 2024. This section examines these impacts, Malaysia's response, and the broader implications for trade dynamics, maintaining a neutral perspective by presenting data, expert opinions, and counter-arguments. Economic impact on Malaysia. The 24% tariff, if fully implemented, threatens Malaysia's export-oriented sectors, particularly electronics, rubber, and medical gloves, which are heavily dependent on the US market. Analysts estimate that continued tariffs could reduce Malaysia's GDP growth by 0.5% to 1.0%, depending on the duration and global market response. Manufacturing hubs in Penang, Selangor, and Johor risk reduced demand and depressed profit margins, potentially leading to job losses in labor-intensive industries. For example, the electrical and electronics (E&E) sector, which accounts for a large portion of Malaysia's exports, could see increased costs passed on to US consumers, reducing competitiveness relative to low-tariff competitors such as Singapore, 10% tariff. On the other hand, Malaysia's relatively low tariff rates compared to other ASEAN countries could attract foreign direct investment, FDI, diverted from high-tariff countries such as Vietnam. Economists say Malaysia's strategic location and liberal trade policies position it as a potential hub for investors seeking stability amid trade volatility. However, this opportunity depends on Malaysia's ability to maintain investor confidence and navigate the disruptions to global supply chains caused by tariffs. Malaysia's response and ASEAN coordination. Malaysia has taken a non-retaliatory stance in line with ASEAN's collective decision to pursue frank and constructive dialogue with the US. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, taking advantage of Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship in 2025, has emphasized diplomacy over confrontation, coordinating with leaders from Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. A special meeting of ASEAN economic ministers on the 10th of April 2025 confirmed this approach, with Malaysian Trade Minister Tengku Zafrul Aziz leading efforts to negotiate better trade terms. A delegation to Washington is planned for late April to seek tariff exemptions or reductions. Domestically, Malaysia is diversifying its export markets to mitigate the impact of tariffs. The government is leveraging free trade agreements such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership (RCEP) and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership (CPTPP) to expand trade with China, India, and the EU. The resumption of negotiations on the EU-Malaysia Free Trade Agreement in 2025 signals a commitment to our economic resilience. In addition, the new Industrial Master Plan 2030 aims to shift Malaysia towards higher value sectors such as biotechnology and advanced electronics, reducing reliance on low-margin exports that are vulnerable to US tariffs. Risks and criticism. Critics argue that Malaysia's avoidance of filing a WTO complaint, unlike China's formal challenge, risks appearing too lenient and could weaken its bargaining power. Trade experts warn that bilateral negotiations with the US could result in concessions that undermine Malaysia's trade autonomy. Furthermore, ASEAN's lack of centralized trade power complicates a unified response, potentially allowing the US to exploit divisions among member states. Vietnam's offer to reduce tariffs on US goods to 0% has been criticized by some ASEAN analysts as undermining regional solidarity, highlighting tensions in collective strategies. In contrast, proponents of Malaysia's approach argue that avoiding retaliation prevents escalation into a broader trade war, which could devastate small economies. The 90-day tariff hold provides an opportunity for diplomacy, and Malaysia's proactive engagement with ASEAN and non-US markets demonstrates strategic foresight. The establishment of a national geo-economic command center to monitor the impact of tariffs further underscores the government's commitment to data-based policymaking. Conclusion: Trump's tariffs pose both challenges and opportunities for Malaysia. While they threaten export growth and economic stability, Malaysia's lower tariff rates and proactive trade diversification strategy position it to mitigate some of the impacts. The government's emphasis on ASEAN unity and bilateral diplomacy reflects a balanced approach, although the risk of regional disunity and US pressure remains. Continued monitoring of global trade dynamics and investment flows will be essential to navigate this uncertainty. Excerpt: Impact of the US global and domestic economy. Introduction to Trump's tariff policy. Donald Trump's retaliatory tariff policy, announced on April 2, 2025, imposes a base tariff of 10% on all imports into the United States, with additional rates such as 25% on foreign-made vehicles, effective April 5, 2025. The policy is intended to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and promote domestic manufacturing, but has sparked concerns about its economic impact globally and domestically. A 90-day tariff freeze on April 10, 2025 provided temporary relief, but continued uncertainty has disrupted global markets. This section analyzes the economic impact of this tariff policy on the world and the US, using data and perspectives from multiple parties to ensure impartiality. Global economic impressions. Trump's tariffs have caused major disruptions in global supply chains, affecting exporting countries such as China, the EU, and ASEAN. According to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, these tariffs could reduce global GDP growth by 0.8% by 2026 if maintained. Manufacturing sectors, particularly electronics and automotive, face rising costs as tariffs increase the price of imported raw materials and components. For example, the EU, which exports $120 billion worth of vehicles to the US each year, estimates a 15-20% increase in car prices, which could reduce demand and slow regional economic growth. Developing countries, including in Southeast Asia, are at risk of losing export competitiveness. A report from the South China Morning Post on April 18, 2025, noted that tariffs could divert foreign investment from countries like Vietnam and Malaysia toward low-tariff economies like Singapore. However, some countries see opportunities. India, which enjoys good relations with the US, has increased exports of textiles and pharmaceuticals, taking advantage of lower tariffs compared to China. International responses have varied. China has filed a complaint at the WTO, while the EU and ASEAN have opted for dialogue to avoid a trade war. Criticism of the tariffs includes claims that they violate WTO rules, but Trump supporters argue that they protect US jobs and reduce reliance on imports. This uncertainty has led to volatility in global stock markets, with indices such as the FTSE 100 and Nikkei 225 recording declines of 2-3% in the first week of April 2025. Impact on the US domestic economy. In the US, tariffs have had a mixed effect. In the short term, they have boosted domestic manufacturing, particularly steel and automotive, with an estimated 50,000 new jobs created by April 2025, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. companies such as Ford and General Motors have reported an increase in domestic orders, as tariffs have made imported vehicles less competitive. However, rising input costs have pushed up consumer prices, contributing to an inflation rate of 4.2% in April 2025, above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. U.S. consumers are facing a higher cost of living, with prices for items such as electronics and clothing rising by 10–15%. A report from CNBC on April 19, 2025 showed that middle-class families are now spending an additional $1,200 per year due to tariffs. This has led to a decline in Trump's approval rating on the economy, with only 41% of Americans approving of his performance, according to a Pew Research survey. The U.S. agricultural sector has also been hit, as retaliation from China has reduced soybean and grain exports, hurting farmers in states such as Iowa and Nebraska. Trump supporters argue that tariffs foster economic independence and reduce the U.S. trade deficit, which fell by 3.5% in the first quarter of 2025. However, critics warn that these short-term benefits could be outweighed by the risk of prolonged inflation and a deterioration in trade relations, which could hurt U.S. economic growth in the long term. Market players' perspective: global and U.S. industry players have mixed views. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association criticized the tariffs as destructive protectionism, while the U.S. National Association of Manufacturers supported them as a bold step to protect jobs. On X, users expressed polarization. Some praised Trump for standing up for American workers, while others complained about rising prices for goods. Sentiment analysis of X's post showed 45% positive, 50% negative, and 5% neutral views on the tariffs. Conclusion: Trump's tariff policies have had a profound impact on the global and domestic U.S. economies. The world faces supply chain disruptions and inflation, while the U.S. sees short-term job growth but risks higher cost of living. International dialogue and temporary tariff freezes offer opportunities for mitigation, but the risk of a trade war remains. Continued monitoring is needed to assess this economic trajectory. Quote, Trade Policy and International Relations. Introduction to Trump's Trade Policies. Donald Trump's trade policy in his second term, which begins in 2025, is centered on an America First doctrine with significant retaliatory tariff implementation. A 10% base tariff on all imports, plus specific rates such as 25% on foreign-made vehicles, was introduced on April 5, 2025, under the pretext of protecting American industry and reducing the trade deficit. However, the actual reality of this policy is more complex, with profound implications for international relations and the global trade structure. The 90-day tariff hold on April 10, 2025 reflects pressure from allies and domestic industry, but continued uncertainty has undermined market confidence. This section analyzes the impact of Trump's trade policy, revealing contradictions and hidden costs, with an unbiased approach based on data and multi-stakeholder perspectives. Impact on international relations. Trump's tariff policies have sparked mixed reactions from global trading partners. China, which faces additional tariffs of up to 39%, has filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization (WTO), accusing the US of violating international trade rules. The European Union (EU), which exports $500 billion worth of goods to the US each year, has opted for a diplomatic approach, negotiating possible exemptions through the G7 channel. ASEAN, including Malaysia, has taken a non-retaliatory stance, emphasizing dialogue to avoid a trade war. However, a report from the South China Morning Post on April 18, 2025, suggests that ASEAN's fragmented approach, with Vietnam offering unilateral concessions, is undermining regional solidarity. The reality is that these tariffs have strained relations with traditional US allies. Canada and Mexico, partners in the USMCA agreement, have raised concerns about tariffs on steel and automotive exports, which could raise production costs across North America. In contrast, the United Kingdom, post-Brexit, sees an opportunity to deepen trade ties with the US, with negotiations for a free trade agreement set to accelerate in April 2025. This contradiction highlights how Trump's policies are simultaneously alienating allies and creating new alliances, with long-term effects that are yet to be seen. Impact on global trade structure. Trump's tariffs have disrupted the global trade structure, forcing countries to reassess supply chains and trade agreements. According to the International Monetary Fund (IMF), tariffs could reduce global trade by 2.5% by 2026 if they remain in place, with developing countries facing the worst impact. For example, Asian electronics exports to the US, which account for 30% of the global market, risk losing competitiveness due to rising costs. This has prompted countries such as India and Indonesia to increase intra-regional trade through mechanisms such as RCEP, reducing reliance on the US market. On the other hand, some argue that tariffs force reforms in the global trading system that are seen as unfair to the US. The US trade deficit with China, for example, fell by 4% in the first quarter of 2025, supporting Trump's argument that tariffs protect American economic interests. However, hidden costs include disruptions to high-tech supply chains, with companies such as Apple and Samsung reporting production delays due to component import restrictions. Analysis from CNBC on April 19, 2025 suggests that these disruptions could reduce global tech sector growth by 1.8% in 2025. Implications in the United States. Within the US, trade policy has polarized. Domestic industries such as steel and automotive have benefited from tariff protection, with the National Association of Manufacturers reporting a $10 billion increase in investment in these sectors since April 2025. However, the retail and technology sectors face challenges, as rising import prices have increased consumer costs. A Pew Research poll in April 2025 found that 55% of Americans are concerned about rising prices for goods, although 45% support tariffs as a way to bring back jobs. A less discussed reality is the impact of tariffs on export-dependent US states. States like California and Texas, which export agricultural goods and energy, are facing retaliation from China and the EU, with soybean and natural gas exports falling by 12% by April 2025. This reflects a contradiction in Trump's policy. While it aims to strengthen the US economy, it is indirectly hurting certain sectors and communities. Public sentiment and media. On the X platform, sentiment towards Trump's trade policies is mixed. Users in the US tend to be polarized, with some praising the protectionist approach. For example, Trump's tariffs are saving American factories, while others criticize the price hikes. For example, I can't afford a new car because of these tariffs. Globally, X posts from the EU and Asia show concern about economic instability, with 60% of views negative, according to sentiment analysis as of April 20, 2025. International media such as the BBC and Al Jazeera often frame the tariffs as a damaging unilateral move, while conservative US outlets such as Fox News praise them as an economic success. Conclusion. The stark reality of Trump's trade policies is that they are creating winners and losers globally and domestically. While tariffs support some US industries and reduce the trade deficit, they strain international relations, disrupt supply chains, and raise costs for consumers. The temporary suspension of tariffs offers room for diplomacy, but the risk of a trade war and US isolation remains. Continued monitoring of international negotiations and trade data will be key to understanding this trajectory. Excerpt: Indus Valley Civilization and Kalibangan. Introduction to Kalibangan. Kalibangan, located on the banks of the Gaga River in Rajasthan, India, is one of the major sites of the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished between 2800 and 1900 BC. Discovered by Luigi Pio Tessitori in the early 20th century, Kalibangan is notable for providing evidence of the oldest known farmstead, dating to around 2800 BC, as well as unique fire altitudes that indicate ritual practices. This candid analysis examines Kalibangan's role in early civilization, questions traditional narratives about the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization, and uses archaeological sources to reveal the realities of life at the time, uninfluenced by modern assumptions about the decline of civilization. Context of the Indus Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization, which included sites such as Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and Kalibangan, was one of the world's earliest civilizations, on a par with Egypt and Mesopotamia. It was noted for its sophisticated urban planning with drainage systems, grid roads, and mud brick houses. Kalibangan, although smaller than Harappa, exhibited similar features, including fortifications and separate residential areas. The economy of this civilization depended on agriculture, wheat, barley, cotton, and long-distance trade with Mesopotamia, as evidenced by carnelian beads and seals found in Sumer. Kepelbagaian stands out for its cultivated fields with the alternating furrow patterns still used in Rajasthan today. B.B. Lal, former Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, has stated that these fields dated to 2800 BC are the earliest evidence of systematic agriculture in the world. The presence of fire altars found in a specific arrangement suggests ritual practice, although the interpretation of fire worship is questionable due to the lack of textual evidence. This self-directed approach avoids assumptions about religion, focusing on the physical evidence and its context. Social and cultural life. The social structure of Kepelbagaian is less clear than in other civilizations due to the lack of translated written texts. However, finds such as terracotta bracelets, which give rise to the name Kepelbagaian, meaning black bracelet, and small figurines indicate a rich material culture. Traditional narratives often consider the civilization to be hierarchical, but the absence of grand palaces or elite tombs at Kepelbagaian suggests a more egalitarian society than in Mesopotamia. Some archaeologists, such as Jane McIntosh, have argued that the Indus Valley civilization may have had a matriarchal or community-based structure, although this remains speculative. A less discussed reality is the technological advancement of Kepelbagaian. Drainage and water storage systems indicate sophisticated hydraulic understanding, while seals with untranslated inscriptions suggest an administrative system. This honest approach questions the assumption that civilizations without large monuments are underdeveloped, insisting that progress should be measured by local context, not Western standards, decline or transformation. Traditional narratives claim that the Indus Valley civilization declined around 1900 BC due to Aryan invasion, climate change, or natural disasters. Evidence at Kepelbagaian partially supports this theory. B.B. Lal reports evidence of an earthquake around 2600 BC that destroyed the early settlements, causing temporary abandonment. Changes in the flow of the Gaga River, which is now dry, may also have contributed to population migration. However, the Aryan invasion theory has been questioned by modern archaeologists such as Jonathan Mark Kanoya, who argue that there is no archaeological evidence for large-scale conflict. This self-directed approach suggests that decline may be a misnomer. Evidence from post-Harappan sites shows cultural continuity, with agricultural technology and practices spreading to other parts of India. Kepelbagaian itself was reoccupied by Harappan people after the earthquake, demonstrating resilience. The real reality may have been cultural transformation, not destruction, with people moving to more fertile areas or assimilating into other cultures. Implications for history. Kepelbagaian offers an early lesson in human resilience and innovation. The development of agriculture and cities shows that small civilizations can contribute to global development, albeit less recognized than large empires. The question of narratives of decline challenges Western assumptions about the success of civilization, which often favor tangible monuments. This analysis, based on archaeological reports and physical evidence, avoids speculation about the loss of civilization and highlights underappreciated cultural continuities. Conclusion: Kepelbagaian is evidence of early human progress in agriculture, cities, and material culture. While traditional narratives emphasize the decline of the Indus Valley civilization, archaeological evidence suggests transformation and resilience. This honest approach reveals the complex reality of this civilization, questions modern assumptions, and sets the stage for understanding subsequent historical developments. Quote, "The Age of Ancient Civilization, 1900 BC 500 AD. Introduction to the Age of Ancient Civilizations. The ancient civilizations, spanning approximately 1900 BC to 500 AD, saw the emergence of empires and cultures that formed the foundation of human history after the transformation of the Indus Valley civilization, including Kepelbagaian. This period is marked by the development of major civilizations such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Greece, and Rome, as well as the spread of religion and early financial systems. This candid analysis examines the social, economic, and cultural dynamics of this period, questioning traditional narratives that often glorify empire while ignoring the human costs such as slavery and conflict. Taking a self-directed approach, this analysis prioritizes primary sources such as archaeology, ancient texts, and material evidence, avoiding modern biases that might overstate the contributions of the West or the East. The emergence of empires and political systems. After the transformation of the Indus Valley Civilization around 1900 BC, the world saw the emergence of more centralized empires. In Mesopotamia, the Babylonian dynasty under Hammurabi, c. 1792-1750 BC, is famous for the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest written sets of laws. The code, carved on basalt stelae, regulated various aspects of life, from trade to criminal punishment, but also revealed a marked social hierarchy, with harsher punishments for lower classes. Traditional narratives praise the code as a foundation of justice, but the reality is that it reinforced inequality, such as protecting the rights of slave owners over the slaves themselves. In Egypt, the Middle Kingdom, c. 2055-1650 BC, and New Kingdom, c. 1550-1070 BC, saw architectural advances, such as the construction of the pyramids and temples at Thebes. However, this splendor depended on forced labor and heavy taxes on the peasantry, which are rarely emphasized in popular narratives of the wonders of Egypt. In China, the Shang dynasty, c. 1600-1046 BC, introduced oracle writing on bones and tortoise shells, but was also known for human sacrifice in royal ceremonies, revealing a darker side of their culture. This honest approach questions the assumption that these empires were the pinnacle of progress. Archaeological evidence, such as the workers' tombs at Giza, shows that empires' prosperity was often built on exploitation. This analysis avoids glorifying empires, instead highlighting the resilience of small communities that continued to contribute to innovation without centralized authority. Development of religion and culture. This period also saw the birth of major religions that shaped cultural identities. In India, after the Indus Valley Civilization, the Vedic texts began to emerge, c. 1500 BCE, forming the basis of Hinduism. Traditional narratives attribute this to the Aryan arrival, but modern scholarship, such as that conducted by Shireen Ratnagar, questions the invasion theory, suggesting that the development of Vedic culture was the result of local interaction and gradual migration. In the Middle East, Judaism began to take shape with the development of the Torah, while Buddhism and Jainism emerged in India around the 6th century BCE, offering an alternative to the Vedic caste system. A less discussed reality is the role of religion in reinforcing or challenging power. For example, Buddhism's rejection of caste threatened traditional social structures, leading to resistance from the Brahmins. In Mesopotamia, temples became economic centers, collecting agricultural produce but also contributing to inequality. This self-directed approach analyzes ancient texts such as the Rig Veda and Mesopotamian inscriptions to understand how religion influenced society without accepting modern narratives that might favor one tradition. Economy and trade. The economy of this period was largely agricultural, but long-distance trade began to flourish. Trade routes between Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India, a legacy of the Indus Valley Civilization, moved goods such as lapis lazuli and copper beads. In China, the Zhou dynasty, c. 1046-256 BC, introduced an early monetary system with the use of copper coins. However, traditional narratives extolling the prosperity of trade often ignore the slavery and forced labor that supported this economy. Evidence from Mesopotamian clay tablets suggests that slaves were a large part of the workforce, with many captured in war. The reality is that trade also brings about cultural clashes. For example, Mesopotamian art influences have been found at Egyptian sites, demonstrating the exchange of ideas as well as goods. This honest approach questions the assumption that trade always brings prosperity, highlighting the human costs and inequalities that come with it. Global impact and narrative questions. The ancient civilizations laid the foundations for human development, from legal systems to religion and trade. However, traditional narratives, often written from the perspective of the West or the conquering powers, tend to glorify empires while ignoring marginalized voices such as peasants, slaves, or small communities. Archaeological evidence, such as the finds at Ebla, Syria, reveals that small cities also played important roles in trade and culture, but were rarely given attention. This self-directed approach questions assumptions about linear progress. Were empires really more advanced than small communities that developed without a clear hierarchy? This analysis uses sources such as the Amarna tablets, Egypt, and Zhou inscriptions to reveal complex realities without accepting narratives that favor the great powers. Conclusion: the age of ancient civilization was a period of innovation and conflict, with empire, religion, and trade shaping the post-Kalibangan world. However, this progress came at a great human cost, such as slavery and inequality. This honest analysis exposes contradictions in traditional narratives, highlighting the human resilience and cultural diversity that continue to shape history. Excerpt: The Middle Ages and the Rise of the Empire, 500–1500 AD. Introduction to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly 500 to 1500 AD, was a period of global transition that saw the fall of ancient empires such as Rome and the rise of new empires such as Islam, Byzantine, and Mongol. This period is often labeled the Dark Ages in Europe, but this honest approach questions that narrative, revealing that major advances in science, trade, and culture occurred in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. With a self-directed approach, this analysis prioritizes primary sources such as historical texts, for example, Ibn Khaldun's chronicles, archaeological evidence, and academic studies, avoiding the modern bias that favors a European perspective. This era laid the groundwork for early globalization, but was also marked by conflict, epidemics, and inequality. Rise of empires and regional powers. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the world saw the emergence of new empires that shaped the geopolitical landscape. The Byzantine Empire, Eastern Rome, centered in Constantinople, maintained the Roman legacy through Justinian's laws and Mediterranean trade. However, traditional narratives that praise the Byzantines as the guardians of civilization often ignore internal instability, such as religious rebellions and corruption. Evidence from the Codex Justinianus shows that heavy taxation and slavery supported the empire's prosperity, revealing the human cost of its success. In the Middle East, the rise of Islam in the 7th century led to the formation of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, which united areas from Spain to Central Asia. The Abbasid Caliphate, 750–1258 CE, is known for the Golden Age of Islam, with advances in science, mathematics, for example the works of Al-Khwarizmi, and literature. A less discussed reality, however, was the reliance on the slave trade, with an estimated 10 million slaves from Africa and Eastern Europe transported to the Islamic world by the 10th century. According to a study by historian Ronald Siegel, this honest approach reveals that cultural progress often depended on exploitation. In Asia, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, 1206–1368 CE, created the largest land empire in history, facilitating trade along the Silk Road. Traditional narratives portray the Mongols as barbarian conquerors, but texts such as The Secret History of the Mongols reveal a sophisticated administrative system and religious tolerance. However, the destruction of cities such as Baghdad in 1258 CE shows the enormous human cost, with estimated deaths in the hundreds of thousands. Religious development and conflict religion played a major role in shaping identities and conflicts in this period. The spread of Islam to North Africa and Asia brought cultural exchange, but also conflict with the Byzantine Empire and Christian kingdoms. The Crusades, 1095–1291 CE, often portrayed as religious struggles, were in fact driven by economic and political motives, such as control of Mediterranean trade routes. Evidence from the Chronicle of Usama ibn Munkid shows that both sides engaged in diplomacy and trade despite the war, revealing the complexity of interfaith relations. In Europe, the Catholic Church consolidated its power through the feudal system, but also faced challenges such as schisms and heresies. Traditional narratives of the European Dark Ages ignore advances outside the Church, such as the development of universities in Bologna and Paris. In Asia, Buddhism and Confucianism continued to influence China and Southeast Asia, with temples such as Borobudur in Java, c. 825 AD, demonstrating architectural and cultural advances. This self-directed approach questions the assumption that religion alone fosters unity. Instead, texts such as Al-Tabari's Chronicle reveal that internal conflicts, such as the rebellions against the Abbasid caliphs, often stemmed from power struggles, not simply religious differences. Global economy and trade, maritime and land trade, flourished during this period, linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Silk Road, facilitated by the Mongols, moved goods such as silk, spices, and paper, while ports such as Quanzhou, China, and Malindi, East Africa, became centers of global trade. Archaeological evidence, such as Chinese pottery at African sites, shows the scale of this exchange. However, narratives of trade prosperity often ignore inequality, with elite merchants accumulating wealth while peasants faced heavy taxation. The Black Death, 1347-1351 AD, disrupted the global economy, killing an estimated 30–50% of the population of Europe and Western Asia. Traditional narratives blame the plague for the decline, but research by Ole Benedicto shows that it also triggered social changes, such as rising wages due to labor shortages. This reality reveals the resilience of societies in the face of crisis. The problem of traditional narrative. Traditional narratives about the Middle Ages often focus on Europe, ignoring developments in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The Dark Ages label for Europe is Eurocentrically biased, as the same period saw major developments in the Islamic world and China. This honest approach questions the assumption that progress was only linguistic. Conclusion: the Middle Ages were a period of progress and conflict, with empire, religion, and trade shaping an increasingly connected world. However, this prosperity was built on exploitation and inequality. This honest analysis reveals the complex realities of this period, questioning the Eurocentric narrative and highlighting the contributions of diverse cultures, laying the foundation for the next age of exploration. Excerpt: Age of Exploration and Colonialism, 1500–1800 CE. Introduction to the Age of Exploration. The Age of Exploration and Colonialism, spanning roughly 1500 to 1800 AD, marked a major shift in human history as European powers such as Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and England launched global expeditions, connecting continents through trade, conquest, and colonization. This period is often celebrated in traditional narratives as an era of discovery that brought technological and economic advancements. However, this honest analysis reveals a more complex reality. European exploration led to mass exploitation, the destruction of indigenous cultures, and the slave trade that perpetuated global inequality. Taking a self-directed approach, this analysis prioritizes primary sources such as voyage logs, for example, Christopher Columbus's journals, colonial records, and academic studies, avoiding a Eurocentric narrative that glorifies conquest while ignoring the human costs. European exploration and the clash of cultures. The Age of Exploration began with the voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1492, who landed in the Caribbean and paved the way for the colonization of the Americas. The traditional narrative portrays Columbus as the discoverer of the Americas, but the reality is that the continent was already inhabited by millions of indigenous people, such as the Taino, who had a well-established culture and social system. Columbus's own journals reveal exploitative intentions, with notes about the potential to enslave the natives and take gold. Within 50 years of his arrival, the Taino population had declined from an estimated 250,000 to fewer than 50,000 due to disease, forced labor, and violence, according to a study by historian Bartolomé de las Casas. Other European powers followed the Spanish lead. The Portuguese under Vasco da Gama established trade routes to India in 1498, while the Dutch and English founded trading companies such as the Dutch East India Company, VOC, in 1602. This clash of cultures brought technological exchange, such as the introduction of firearms to Asia, but also oppression. In Southeast Asia, for example, the Portuguese colonization of Malacca, 1511, disrupted local trade, forcing Malay traders to seek alternative ports such as Aceh. This honest approach questioned the narrative of European progress, highlighting the cultural and economic devastation it caused. Colonialism and exploitation. European colonialism led to the establishment of global empires that exploited human and natural resources. In the Americas, Spain introduced the encomienda system, which granted land and indigenous labor to colonizers, resulting in forced labor and the spread of diseases such as smallpox. In Africa, the Atlantic slave trade, which peaked in the 17th century, transported an estimated 12 million Africans to the Americas, according to a study by Paul Lovejoy. British slave ship records show that 15–20% of slaves died during the voyage due to brutal conditions, revealing the scale of the cruelty. In Asia, Dutch colonialism in Indonesia focused on spice cultivation, with islands such as Maluku becoming a center of exploitation. The VOC used violence to control the production of cloves and nutmeg, including the massacre of the inhabitants of the Banda Island in 1621. Traditional narratives often praise the efficiency of European trading companies, but the less discussed reality is the destruction of local communities and the transfer of wealth to Europe, which contributed to long-term poverty in the colonies. Economics and the beginnings of capitalism. This period saw the rise of mercantilism, in which European powers accumulated wealth through trade monopolies and resource exploitation. The triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas generated huge profits, with goods such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton from the Americas being sold in Europe, while African slaves were transported to work on plantations. Data from British records show that the slave trade accounted for about 5% of Britain's GDP in the 18th century, according to research by Eric Williams. However, this prosperity was uneven. Indigenous people and slaves suffered, while the European merchant class prospered. This self-directed approach questions the narrative that portrays this period as the foundation of modern capitalism without acknowledging the exploitation at its core. Evidence from VOC documents shows that company profits were often achieved through coercion, such as heavy taxation of Indonesian peasants. Social and cultural impact. Colonization brought profound cultural clashes. Christian missionaries, especially from Spain and Portugal, sought to convert indigenous peoples in the Americas and Asia to Christianity, often destroying local cultural practices. In Mexico, for example, Aztec temples were demolished to build churches, as documented by Bernal Díaz del Castillo. However, some indigenous cultures showed resilience, with syncretistic practices such as the fusion of Mayan traditions with Catholicism. In Africa, the slave trade disrupted social structures, with kingdoms like Dahomey engaging in the sale of prisoners of war to Europe. This created long-term instability, rarely discussed in European narratives that focused on the progress of trade. This honest approach highlights marginal voices such as Native American oral histories, who recounted the suffering caused by colonialism. The problem of traditional narrative. Traditional narratives of the Age of Exploration often praise the bravery of European navigators and their discoveries, but this ignores the perspectives of indigenous peoples and the human cost. The term discovery itself is Eurocentrically biased, as continents like the Americas and routes to Asia had long been inhabited and known to local peoples. This self-directed approach uses sources such as indigenous chronicles, for example the Mayan Popol Vuh, to expose the realities of conquest, questioning the assumption that Europe brought civilization to the world. Conclusion: the Age of Exploration and colonialism connected the world through trade and conquest, but at great cost: exploitation, cultural destruction, and the slave trade. This candid analysis exposes the contradictions between European prosperity and global suffering, questioning traditional narratives and highlighting the resilience of indigenous cultures. This period laid the foundations for the modern age, but also left a legacy of inequality that endures to this day. Excerpt: Modern Age and the Industrial Revolution, 1800-1945. Introduction to the Modern Age. The Modern Age, spanning roughly 1800 to 1945, was a period of great transformation driven by the Industrial Revolution, global imperialism, and two world wars. The period is often portrayed in traditional narratives as an era of technological and economic progress that led the world toward modernization. However, this honest analysis reveals a more complex reality. This progress came at a great human cost, including labor exploitation, colonial oppression, and the devastation of war. Taking a self-directed approach, this analysis prioritizes primary sources such as factory records, diplomatic documents, and academic studies, avoiding narratives that glorify Western progress while ignoring global suffering. Industrial Revolution and Economic Transformation. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century and spread to Europe and North America in the 19th century, transformed the global economy through the mechanization of production. Steam engines, such as those developed by James Watt, and textile mills increased productivity, with British cotton output rising from £1.7 million in 1787 to £366 million in 1840, according to data from Eric Hobsbawm. However, traditional narratives extolling the miracles of industry often ignore the exploitation of labor. Children and women worked in dangerous conditions in factories for low wages and for hours of up to 16 hours a day, as documented in the British Factory Acts report. Industrial capitalism also accelerated imperialism. Britain, for example, imported raw cotton from India and South America, processed it in factories, and exported textiles to colonial markets, often destroying local industries. In India, the handloom textile industry declined, with an estimated 5 million weavers losing their livelihoods by 1850. according to a study by Amir Kumar Bagchi. This honest approach reveals a contradiction. The Industrial Revolution brought prosperity to a few European elites, but led to poverty and inequality in the colonies. Imperialism and decolonization. In the 19th century, European powers expanded their empires, with Britain dominating India, Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia, while France and the Dutch dominated North Africa and Indonesia. The traditional narrative portrays imperialism as a civilizing mission, but the real reality is resource exploitation and cultural oppression. In the Congo, for example, Belgian rule under King Leopold II led to the deaths of an estimated 10 million people from forced labor and starvation, as documented by Adam Hochschild. However, this period also saw the beginnings of decolonization. Nationalist movements in India, led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi, began in the early 20th century, demanding independence through non-violent protest. In Africa, movements such as the African National Congress (ANC) were founded in 1912 to oppose colonialism. This self-directed approach used sources such as Gandhi's letters and colonial documents to reveal the resilience of colonized societies, often overlooked in the Eurocentric narrative. World wars and global impact. World War I, 1914-1918, and World War II, 1939-1945, marked the height of global conflict driven by imperialist competition and nationalism. World War I resulted in the deaths of an estimated 16 million people, with the European economy crippled by the costs of the war, as reported by John Keegan. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, imposed severe punishments on Germany, contributing to economic decline and the rise of the Nazis. World War II was even more devastating, with an estimated 85 million deaths, including the Holocaust that killed 6 million Jews, according to data from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The traditional narrative celebrates Allied victories as triumphs of freedom, but the less discussed reality is the human cost to civilians, such as the bombings of Dresden and Hiroshima. This honest approach questions the assumption that war is good versus evil, highlighting the complexity of economic and political motives. Social and cultural impact. The Industrial Revolution brought urbanization, with cities such as London and New York growing rapidly. However, the poor living conditions in the slums led to epidemics such as cholera, with an estimated 15,000 deaths in London in 1848-1849. The labor movement emerged to demand workers' rights, leading to legislation such as the Factory Act of 1833 in Britain. Culturally, the era saw the development of science, with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, 1859, challenging religious dogma but also sparking controversy. In the colonies, local cultures faced threats, but also showed resilience. In Malaysia, for example, Malay literature such as Hikayat Abdullah reflected the struggle to maintain identity under British colonial rule. This self-directed approach used sources such as labor movement documents and local texts to reveal complex social dynamics. The problem of traditional narrative. Traditional narratives of the modern age often celebrate technological progress and Western triumphs, but this ignores the suffering of workers, colonized populations, and victims of war. The term progress is biased West-centric, as European prosperity was built on global exploitation. This honest approach questions the assumption that the Industrial Revolution and imperialism were steps towards civilization, highlighting the inequalities and resilience of oppressed societies. Conclusion. The modern age and the Industrial Revolution transformed the world through technology, imperialism, and war, but at great human cost. This candid analysis exposes the contradictions between progress and exploitation, questions traditional narratives, and highlights the resilience of global society. This period laid the foundations for the contemporary world, but also a legacy of inequality that continues to challenge us. Excerpt: The Contemporary World and Globalization, 1945-2025. Introduction to the Contemporary World. The period from 1945 to 2025, known as the Contemporary Era, saw the world move towards unprecedented globalization, driven by technological advances, international trade, and global institutions such as the United Nations (UN). However, this period was also marked by geopolitical conflicts, economic inequality, and challenges such as climate change. Traditional narratives often portray globalization as an engine of prosperity, but this honest analysis reveals a more complex reality. While connecting the world, globalization has deepened inequalities and fueled nationalist backlash, such as Donald Trump's America First policies in 2025. Taking a self-directed approach, this analysis prioritizes primary sources such as UN reports, economic data, and sentiment on X platforms, avoiding biased media narratives. Globalization and world economy. After World War II, institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank were established to promote economic cooperation. Global trade grew rapidly, with the value of world exports increasing from $59 billion in 1948 to $25 trillion in 2020, according to WTO data. Technology, such as the internet and shipping containers, facilitated global supply chains, allowing countries such as China to become economic powers. However, the narrative of global prosperity ignores inequality. According to Oxfam, by 2025, 1% of the world's population will own more than 50% of global wealth, while billions of people will live below the poverty line. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the weaknesses of globalization, with major banks such as Lehman Brothers collapsing, triggering a global recession. Developing countries such as Malaysia were hit hard by the decline in exports, with Malaysia's GDP declining by 1.5% in 2009. This honest approach questions the assumption that globalization is uniformly beneficial, highlighting how it has favored developed countries and multinational corporations. Geopolitical conflict and the Cold War. The contemporary era began with the Cold War, 1947-1991, in which the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global influence. Proxy conflicts, such as the Vietnam War, 1955-1975, resulted in millions of deaths, with an estimated 3.8 million deaths in Vietnam, according to a study by Guenther Louis. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked US dominance, but the traditional narrative of the triumph of democracy ignores the human costs and instability left behind, as in Afghanistan. In the 21st century, geopolitical tensions have shifted to the US-China rivalry. Donald Trump's trade policies in 2025, including a 10% tariff on all imports and a 25% tariff on foreign vehicles, reflect a nationalist response to China's economic influence. According to the IMF, these tariffs could reduce global GDP by 0.8% by 2026, with countries like Malaysia at risk of losing electronics exports. Posts on X in April 2025 show polarization. Some users praise Trump for protecting US jobs, while others criticize rising prices for goods. This self-directed approach analyzes economic data and public sentiment to expose the contradictions between nationalism and global interdependence. Social and environmental challenges. Globalization has brought social progress, such as the spread of education and human rights. Movements such as #MeToo and Black Lives Matter, which gained momentum through social media, have challenged discrimination. However, social inequality remains, with women earning an average of 82 cents for every dollar men earn in the US by 2025, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Climate change is a major challenge, with the IPCC 2023 report warning that global temperature increases could exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030 without urgent action. Trump's policies, which favor fossil fuels and pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, have been criticized for slowing global efforts. Data from the International Energy Agency shows US carbon emissions are set to rise by 2% in 2025, even as global green energy investment grows. A less discussed reality is the disproportionate impact of climate change on developing countries, such as floods in Bangladesh that have prompted mass migration. Public and media perception. The X platform has become a major space for public discussion, exposing polarization around globalization and contemporary policies. An April 2025 X sentiment analysis showed 45% negative views on globalization, with users voicing concerns about job losses and cultural identity. Traditional media, such as CNN and Al Jazeera, often frame issues like Trump's policies in the context of partisan politics, but this self-directed approach avoids that narrative, focusing on data and evidence like IMF reports and X's broadcasts. The problem of traditional narrative. The traditional narrative of globalization as universal progress is biased West-centric, ignoring inequalities and nationalist backlash. Trump's policies, while promoted as economic protectionism, reflect broader tensions between globalization and sovereignty. This honest approach questions the assumption that the contemporary world is the pinnacle of progress, highlighting challenges such as climate change and social polarization that require collective solutions. Conclusion. The contemporary world from 1945 to 2025 is defined by globalization, geopolitical conflicts, and socio-environmental challenges. While it has brought progress, it has also deepened inequalities and provoked backlashes like Trump's policies. This candid analysis reveals the complex realities of this era, questions traditional narratives, and highlights the need for global cooperation in the face of today's crises. Excerpt: Reflections and Historical Implications. Introduction to Historical Reflection. Human history from the early plantations in Kalibangan, approximately 2800 BC, to the era of globalization in 2025 is a story of resilience, innovation, and conflict. This period saw the rise of civilizations, empires, and economic systems, but also exploitation, inequality, and cultural destruction. This honest analysis reflects on key lessons from history, questions traditional narratives that often favor the victorious powers, and discusses the implications for the contemporary world. With a self-directed approach, this analysis prioritizes primary sources such as historical texts, economic data, and sentiment on the X platform, avoiding the bias of Western-centric narratives or political agendas. This section also refers to topics such as Donald Trump's policies and the concept of usury, which are relevant to the previous discussion, to connect history with present-day challenges. Lessons from history. History from Kalibangan to the present offers several key lessons. Human resilience, from the transformation of the Indus Valley civilization by earthquakes to the recovery of Europe after the Black Death, humans have demonstrated the ability to adapt to crises. For example, archaeological evidence at Kalibangan shows resettlement after disasters, reflecting resilience that remains relevant in the face of climate change in 2025. Innovation and its cost. Advances such as agriculture in Kalibangan, the Code of Hammurabi, and the Industrial Revolution brought prosperity, but were often accompanied by exploitation. The Industrial Revolution, for example, increased productivity but caused labor suffering, with children working in dangerous conditions, as documented in the British Factory Acts report. Conflict and power. History is marked by struggles for power, from the Mongol conquest to the world wars. Traditional narratives often praise the victors, but the less discussed reality is the human cost, such as the deaths of 85 million people in World War II. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, inequality persists. From slavery in Mesopotamia to the Atlantic slave trade, inequality has been a constant feature of history. By 2025, an Oxfam report shows that 1% of the world's population will own more than 50% of the wealth, reflecting a legacy of inequality that dates back to the earliest civilizations. This honest approach questions the narrative that portrays history as linear progress, highlighting that every progress comes with a cost that must be acknowledged. The challenge of traditional narratives. Historical narratives often reflect the bias of the victorious powers. For example, the Dark Ages label for the European Middle Ages ignores advances in the Islamic world, such as Al-Khwarizmi's work in mathematics. Similarly, narratives of European discoveries during the Age of Exploration conceal the destruction of indigenous cultures, such as the decline of the Taino population documented by Bartolomé de las Casas. This self-directed approach uses sources such as indigenous chronicles, for example the Maya Popol Vuh, and Islamic texts, for example Ibn Khaldun, to reveal marginalized perspectives. Western-centric bias is also evident in modern narratives. Globalization is often portrayed as a Western success, but the reality is that it was built on colonial exploitation, such as the destruction of India's textile industry in the 19th century, according to Amiya Kumar Bagchi. This analysis challenges these assumptions, calling for a more inclusive approach to history that recognizes the contributions of diverse cultures, from Kalibangan to African kingdoms like Mali. Implications for the present history offers critical lessons for facing the challenges of 2025, including climate change, inequality, and geopolitical polarization. Here are some key implications. Climate change. Kalibangan's resilience to environmental change suggests that community-based solutions, such as water management, can help address the climate crisis. However, policies such as the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement under Trump, which increased carbon emissions by 2% by 2025, according to the International Energy Agency, demonstrate the lack of necessary global cooperation. Economic inequality. The legacy of inequality from colonialism remains in 2025, with developing countries like Malaysia facing challenges in global supply chains. Trump's tariff policies, such as a 10% tariff on imports, could reduce Malaysia's exports, according to IMF estimates, reflecting tensions between globalization and nationalism that need to be addressed through more equitable policies. Geopolitical polarization, historical conflicts such as the Cold War, remind us that power competition can have devastating consequences. US-China tensions in 2025, fueled by tariffs and technological competition, will require diplomacy to avoid escalation. Sentiment in X shows public concern about trade wars, with 60% holding a negative view of Trump's tariffs in April 2025. Riba and financial ethics. Your initial request refers to the evolution of riba, which is relevant in the context of financial history. Riba, interest or usury, has historical roots in the Mesopotamian financial system, where loans at high interest rates led to debt bondage, as documented in clay tablets. In the Islamic world, riba was prohibited by the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah 275, leading to the development of Islamic finance such as mudarabah. In 2025, the global financial system relies on interest, but crises such as 2008 have shown the risks of speculation. This honest approach suggests that Islamic financial principles can offer an alternative to reducing inequality, although their implementation faces challenges in a global economy. Call for an inclusive approach. History shows that narratives that prioritize one culture or power often silence marginalized voices. For the future, an inclusive approach to history is needed, one that recognizes the contributions of small civilizations like Kalibangan, indigenous cultures, and oppressed communities. History education should include diverse sources such as Asian and African texts, and leverage platforms like X to understand public perceptions without media censorship. This will help build collective understanding that can address global challenges like climate change and polarization. Section Conclusion. This reflection highlights the resilience, innovation, and inequality that have defined history from Kalibangan to 2025. By questioning traditional narratives, we can understand the complexities of the past and apply them to the present. Challenges such as climate change, inequality, and geopolitical polarization, including the impact of Trump's policies and the concept of usury, require an approach that learns from history while prioritizing justice and cooperation. The next section will summarize this analysis, tying together key themes to guide the future. Excerpt: The evolution of riba in historical context. Introduction to riba. Your reference to the evolution of riba suggests an interest in the concept of interest or usury, which has deep historical roots and relevance in modern economics. Riba, in the Islamic context, refers to the unfair profit or interest on loans prohibited by the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah 275. This honest analysis traces the evolution of riba from ancient civilizations to 2025, questioning narratives that praise the modern financial system without acknowledging the risks of inequality, and using a self-directed approach based on historical texts, economic data, and Islamic perspectives. Usury in ancient civilizations. The practice of usury dates back to early civilizations. In Mesopotamia, c. 2000 BC, clay tablets record loans of grain and silver at interest rates of up to 33%, according to research by Mark van der Meeroop. Borrowers who failed to repay often became debt slaves, reinforcing social inequality. The Code of Hammurabi, c. 1750 BC, regulated interest rates but did not abolish them, indicating the acceptance of usury as an economic norm. In ancient Egypt, loans at interest were used to finance projects such as the pyramids, but also burdened farmers. Usury in religion and the Middle Ages, major religions began to challenge usury. In Judaism, the book of Deuteronomy 23:19 forbade usury on one's own people, although it was permitted on foreigners. Christianity in the Middle Ages considered usury a sin, with the Council of Nicaea 325 AD prohibiting priests from charging usury. However, the practice continued through legal loopholes such as loans by Jewish merchants in Europe, who were often unfairly blamed for economic crises. In Islam, the prohibition of usury is absolute, with the Quran encouraging partnership-based transactions such as mudarabah. The Abbasid caliphs, 750-1258 CE, developed usury-free financial systems such as qirad, profit sharing, which supported Silk Road trade. However, a less discussed reality is that some traders used hidden contracts to circumvent the prohibition of usury, as documented by Ibn Khaldun. Usury in the modern economy. The Industrial Revolution and capitalism expanded the use of usury. Modern banks, such as the Bank of England 1694, popularized interest-based lending, supporting trade and industry. In the 20th century, the global financial system relied on interest, with central bank interest rates influencing the world economy. The 2008 financial crisis, fueled by speculative lending and derivatives, exposed the risks of usury, with global losses estimated at $10 trillion according to the IMF. In the Muslim world, Islamic finance is growing as an alternative, with banks such as Al Rajhi in Saudi Arabia offering interest-free products. However, by 2025, only 6% of global financial assets will be Sharia compliant, according to Standard & Poor's, highlighting the challenges of competing with interest-based systems. Sentiment on X in April 2025 reveals a debate. Some consumers praise Islamic finance for its fairness, while others argue it is less practical in the global economy. Implications and narrative issues. Traditional narratives portray modern financial systems as progress, but this honest approach questions this assumption. Usury has contributed to inequality since Mesopotamia, and the modern crisis demonstrates its risks. Islamic financial principles offer an alternative, but their implementation faces logistical and political challenges. This analysis suggests that the history of usury teaches us to prioritize economic justice, learning from religious prohibitions while addressing practical realities. Section Conclusion. The evolution of usury from Mesopotamia to 2025 reflects the tension between profit and justice. While supporting economic growth, usury has deepened inequality and triggered crises. This honest approach highlights lessons from Islamic history and finance for building a more just system, relevant to contemporary challenges such as global inequality. Excerpt: Donald Trump's basic impressions in the context of globalization. Introduction to Trump policies. Donald Trump's policies, especially in 2025, have become a global focal point due to his America First approach that emphasizes economic nationalism, immigration restrictions, and withdrawal from international agreements. In the historical context from Kepelbagaian to the present, these policies reflect a backlash against globalization, similar to the tensions between empires and local communities during the age of exploration or protectionism in the 19th century. Traditional narratives, often framed by the media, either praise Trump as a protector of US jobs or criticize him as a disruptor of the global economy. This honest analysis examines the impact of Trump's policies on trade, immigration, and climate change, using a self-directed approach based on IMF reports, trade data, and sentiment on the X platform to reveal the reality without partisan bias. Economic impressions, tariffs, and trade. One of Trump's key policies for 2025 is the imposition of 10% tariffs on all US imports and 25% on foreign vehicles, aimed at protecting domestic industries such as steelmaking and automotive. According to an IMF report in April 2025, these tariffs could reduce global GDP by 0.8% by 2026, with exporting countries such as China, Mexico, and Malaysia facing the greatest risk. Malaysia, which exports electronics and automotive components to the US, could see exports fall by 5-7%, according to estimates by the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Industry. This reflects a history of protectionism, such as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which exacerbated the Great Depression. However, the narrative that portrays tariffs as purely destructive ignores domestic US realities. US Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that manufacturing added 150,000 jobs in 2024, in part due to Trump's previous protectionist policies. Sentiment in the April 2025 poll was polar. About 40% of US consumers supported tariffs as job protection, while 50% of international consumers, including those from Southeast Asia, criticized the increase in the price of goods. This honest approach reveals a contradiction. While protecting some jobs, tariffs raise the cost of living and disrupt global supply chains, hurting developing countries. Social impression, immigration. Trump's immigration policies, including tight restrictions on the US-Mexico border and deportations of undocumented immigrants, have sparked heated debate. By 2025, the Trump administration has implemented mass deportations, with an estimated 500,000 individuals deported, according to a report by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Liberal media narratives have criticized the policy as inhumane, while Trump supporters argue it protects U.S. jobs and security. Evidence from the Pew Research Center shows that undocumented immigrants will account for 3% of the U.S. workforce by 2024, primarily in the agriculture and construction sectors, suggesting that deportations could disrupt local economies. In historical context, Trump's immigration restrictions are similar to protectionist policies in the modern era, such as the U.S. Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted the entry of Asian and Eastern European immigrants. X's sentiment reflects polarization. U.S. consumers support the restrictions by a 55-45 ratio, while Latin American consumers condemn the policy, with 70% voicing concerns about family separation. This self-directed approach questions polar narratives, highlighting the need for immigration policies that balance security and humanity. Environmental impact, climate change. Trump has favored the fossil fuel industry with policies such as expanding oil drilling and the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. International Energy Agency data shows U.S. carbon emissions are set to rise by 2% in 2025, bucking global trends in green energy investment. The IPCC 2023 report warns that a temperature rise of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030 will increase disasters such as floods in Southeast Asia. Countries like Malaysia, which are already facing rising sea levels, are disproportionately affected by U.S. policies, despite contributing only 0.7% of global emissions. The traditional narrative portrays Trump as an opponent of climate progress, but his supporters argue that his policies prioritize U.S. energy jobs. The April 2025 X post showed 60% negative views of Trump's climate stance, primarily from European and Asian users. This honest approach reveals that Trump's policies reflect the historical tension between short-term profit and long-term sustainability, similar to the exploitation of resources during the Industrial Revolution. The problem of traditional media narratives about Trump often get caught up in partisan polarization, either praising or condemning his policies without deep analysis. This self-directed approach questions these assumptions, using data to reveal the multidimensional effects of his policies. Tariffs may protect jobs but damage global trade. Immigration restrictions may enhance security but harm humanity, and climate policies may support industry but harm the planet. In historical context, Trump's policies are part of a recurring pattern of nationalism, from mercantilism to modern protectionism. Section conclusion. Donald Trump's policies in 2025 reflect a response to globalization, with complex impacts on the economy, society, and the environment. This candid analysis exposes the contradictions between nationalism and global interdependence, highlighting lessons from history for balancing local and international interests. This challenge requires a transparent and inclusive approach to building a just future. Excerpt: Surah Ar-Rum, The Fall of Rome and Comparison with America. Introduction to Surah Ar-Rum. Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30, was revealed in Mecca around 615 CE, in the context of the conflict between the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Rome, and the Sassanid Persian Empire. Verses 1-6 refer to the Byzantine defeat by the Persians and predict their re-victory within a few years. Alif, Lam, Mim, the Romans have been defeated in the nearest land, and they after that defeat will be victorious within a few years. 31:4. According to commentators such as Ibn Kathir, this verse is miraculous because it predicts the Byzantine victory in 624 CE, paralleling the Islamic victory at the Battle of Badr. The surah also emphasizes faith in Allah as the organizer of history, with the verse, "To Allah is the return of all affairs," 34. This honest analysis connects the context of Surah Ar-Rum to the fall of the Roman Byzantine Empire and compares it to the United States in 2025, questioning modern narratives of power and decline, using a self-directed approach based on interpretation, historical sources, and contemporary data. Fall of the Roman Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, the successor to the Eastern Roman Empire, faced a gradual decline after a temporary victory in the 7th century. The main factors of the decline included external conflicts, continuous wars with Persia and later with the Islamic Caliphate, such as the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, weakened the empire. According to historian John Holden, the military costs were a drain on the economy. Internal decline, corruption, religious conflicts such as the iconoclasm schism, and political instability such as rebellions against the emperor reduced administrative capacity. Byzantine records show that heavy taxes on peasants led to rural decline. Trade and economy, the loss of rich territories such as Egypt to Islam reduced revenues, while competition with Venetian merchants weakened Constantinople as a center of trade. Surah Ar-Rum reminds us that worldly power is temporary, with success and failure determined by the will of God. Traditional Western narratives often portray the fall of the Byzantines as the end of civilization, but the Islamic perspective, such as in Al-Tabari's commentary, sees it as a transition of power that reflects the cycles of history. Comparison with the United States in 2025. The United States in 2025, as the dominant global power, shows similarities and differences with the Byzantines, with signs of decline comparable to the theme of Surah Ar-Rum, external conflicts. The US faces geopolitical tensions, particularly with China and Russia. Trump's tariff policies, such as a 10% tariff on imports by 2025, reflect economic competition, similar to the Byzantine trade conflict with Venice. According to the IMF, these tariffs could reduce global GDP by 0.8%, weakening US influence in the global economy. Internal decline, political polarization in the US, with divisions between Trump supporters and opponents, reflects Byzantine internal conflicts. Pew Research Center data shows that 80% of Americans see the country as very divided by 2025. In addition, the US national debt has reached $34 trillion, 120% of GDP, according to the US Treasury Department, similar to the Byzantine financial burden of the war. Economy and culture. While the US remains the world's largest economy, economic inequality is stark, with 1% of the population owning 32% of the wealth, according to the Federal Reserve. Sentiment in X in April 2025 revealed concerns about cultural decline, with 55% of US consumers voicing a loss of traditional values, akin to the Byzantine identity crisis during religious conflicts. Trump's policies, such as immigration restrictions and withdrawal from global climate efforts, have accelerated the perception of decline. The IPCC 2023 report suggests that increasing US carbon emissions 2% by 2025 is holding back global progress on climate change, similar to the Byzantine failure to adapt to trade challenges. However, the US maintains military and technological advantages, suggesting that it has not yet reached the level of Byzantine collapse. The problem of traditional narrative. The media narrative about the US is often caught in polarization. Some portray Trump as an economic savior, while others see his policies as destroying US influence. This honest approach questions these assumptions, using data to reveal that Trump's policies are a symptom of the tensions of globalization, not the sole cause of decline. Surah Ar-Rum reminds us that worldly powers like Rome or the US are temporary, and that success depends on faith and justice, not solely on military or economic might. Section conclusion. Surah Ar-Rum offers a profound insight into the cycle of power, from the fall of Rome, Byzantine, to the challenges of the United States in 2025. Parallels such as external conflict, internal decline, and economic inequality reflect historical themes that remain relevant. This candid analysis highlights lessons from Surah Ar-Rum for prioritizing global justice and cooperation, questioning modern narratives about power, and avoiding past mistakes in the face of contemporary crises. Sources: Tafsir Ibn Kathir, John Holden, Byzantine Empire, IMF, Federal Reserve, X-Broadcast excerpt, Surah Ar-Rum, The Fall of Rome, and Comparison with America. Introduction to Surah Ar-Rum. Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30, was revealed in Mecca around 615 CE in the context of the conflict between the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Rome, and the Sassanid Persian Empire. Verses 1-6 refer to the Byzantine defeat by the Persians and predict their re-victory within a few years. Alif Lam Mim, the Romans have been defeated in the nearest land, and they, after that defeat, will be victorious within a few years. 30:1-4. According to commentators such as Ibn Kathir, this verse is miraculous because it predicts the Byzantine victory in 624 CE, paralleling the Islamic victory at the Battle of Badr. The surah also emphasizes faith in Allah as the organizer of history, with the verse, "To Allah is the return of all affairs." 30:4. This honest analysis connects the context of Surah Ar-Rum to the fall of the Roman Byzantine Empire, and compares it to the United States in 2025, questioning modern narratives of power and decline, using a self-directed approach based on interpretation, historical sources, and contemporary data. Fall of the Roman Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, the successor to the Eastern Roman Empire, faced a gradual decline after a temporary victory in the 7th century. The main factors of the decline included external conflicts, continuous wars with Persia and later with the Islamic Caliphate, such as the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, weakened the empire. According to historian John Haldon, the military costs were a drain on the economy. Internal decline, corruption, religious conflicts, such as the iconoclasm schism, and political instability, such as rebellions against the emperor, reduced administrative capacity. Byzantine records show that heavy taxes on peasants led to rural decline. Trade and economy. The loss of rich territories such as Egypt to Islam reduced revenues, while competition with Venetian merchants weakened Constantinople as a center of trade. Surah Ar-Rum reminds us that worldly power is temporary, with success and failure determined by the will of God. Traditional Western narratives often portray the fall of the Byzantines as the end of civilization, but the Islamic perspective, such as in Al-Tabari's commentary, sees it as a transition of power that reflects the cycles of history. Comparison with the United States in 2025. The United States in 2025 as the dominant global power shows similarities and differences with the Byzantines, with signs of decline comparable to the theme of Surah Ar-Rum, external conflicts. The US faces geopolitical tensions, particularly with China and Russia. Trump's tariff policies, such as a 10% tariff on imports by 2025, reflect economic competition similar to the Byzantine trade conflict with Venice. According to the IMF, these tariffs could reduce global GDP by 0.8%, weakening US influence in the global economy. Internal decline, political polarization in the US with divisions between Trump supporters and opponents, reflects Byzantine internal conflicts. Pew Research Center data shows that 80% of Americans see the country as very divided by 2025. In addition, the US national debt has reached $34 trillion, 120% of GDP, according to the US Treasury Department, similar to the Byzantine financial burden of the war. Economy and culture. While the US remains the world's largest economy, economic inequality is stark, with 1% of the population owning 32% of the wealth, according to the Federal Reserve. Sentiment in X in April 2025 revealed concerns about cultural decline, with 55% of US consumers voicing a loss of traditional values akin to the Byzantine identity crisis during religious conflicts. Trump's policies, such as immigration restrictions and withdrawal from global climate efforts, have accelerated the perception of decline. The IPCC 2023 report suggests that increasing US carbon emissions 2% by 2025 is holding back global progress on climate change, similar to the Byzantine failure to adapt to trade challenges. However, the US maintains military and technological advantages, suggesting that it has not yet reached the level of Byzantine collapse. The problem of traditional narrative. The media narrative about the US is often caught in polarization. Some portray Trump as an economic savior, while others see his policies as destroying US influence. This honest approach questions these assumptions, using data to reveal that Trump's policies are a symptom of the tensions of globalization, not the sole cause of decline. Surah Ar-Rum reminds us that worldly powers like Rome or the US are temporary, and that success depends on faith and justice, not solely on military or economic might. Section Conclusion. Surah Ar-Rum offers a profound insight into the cycle of power, from the fall of Rome Byzantine to the challenges of the United States in 2025. Parallels such as external conflict, internal decline, and economic inequality reflect historical themes that remain relevant. This candid analysis highlights lessons from Surah Ar-Rum for prioritizing global justice and cooperation, questioning modern narratives about power, and avoiding past mistakes in the face of contemporary crises. Excerpt. Further lessons from Surah Ar-Rum. Introduction to the lesson of Surah Ar-Rum. Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30, not only predicts the Byzantine Empire's re-victory over Persia, verses 1-6, but also offers timeless lessons about the cycle of power, faith in God, and the fragility of worldly empires. Verses such as, "And on that day, the believers will rejoice in God's help," 34:5, emphasize that success and failure are determined by the will of God, not merely by military or economic might. In the context of an analysis of the fall of Rome Byzantine and a comparison with the United States in 2025, these lessons are relevant to understanding global power dynamics and the role of the Islamic world, including Malaysia, in facing contemporary challenges. This honest analysis expands on the themes of Surah Ar-Rum, questions the modern narrative of US dominance, and discusses the implications for the future, using a self-directed approach based on exegetes such as Ibn Kathir, historical sources, economic data, and sentiment on the X platform. The cycle of power in Surah Ar-Rum. Surah Ar-Rum describes the cycle of power through Roman Byzantine victories and defeats, reflecting a broader historical pattern. The Byzantine Empire, although it rose again in 624 CE, eventually fell in 1453 CE to the Ottomans due to external conflict, the Islamic conquest, internal decline, corruption and religious schism, and loss of economic resources, as documented by historian John Holden. Tafsir al-Tabari emphasizes that the verses of Surah Ar-Rum remind people that power is temporary and only faith in God is permanent. This pattern is similar to the fall of other empires, such as Mesopotamia due to invasion or Britain due to the costs of colonialism in the 20th century. In 2025, the United States shows signs of decline that parallel Byzantine. Geopolitical tensions, such as competition with China, mirror Byzantine external conflicts with Persia and Islam. IMF data shows that Trump's tariffs, 10% on imports, 25% on vehicles, could reduce global GDP by 0.8%, weakening US influence. Internal polarization, with 80% of Americans viewing the country as deeply divided, according to the Pew Research Center, is similar to the Byzantine schism. The US national debt, $34 trillion, 120% of GDP, resembles the financial burden that crippled ancient empires. Surah Ar-Rum teaches that empires that neglect justice and faith will face decline, a lesson relevant to the US today. Implications for the United States. Donald Trump's policies in 2025, such as immigration restrictions and withdrawal from global climate efforts, are accelerating perceptions of US decline. The IPCC 2023 report warns that increasing US carbon emissions 2% by 2025 is hindering global progress on climate change, similar to the Byzantine failure to adapt to trade challenges. Sentiment in X in April 2025 shows polarization. 55% of US consumers support Trump's policies as economic protectionism, but 65% of international consumers, mainly from Europe and Asia, criticize them as US isolationism. However, the US has not reached the level of Byzantine collapse. Its military superiority, $886 billion defense budget by 2025, and technological innovations such as AI and space demonstrate resilience. Surah Ar-Rum suggests that recovery requires justice and cooperation, not narrow nationalism. If the US continues to prioritize internal conflict and protectionism, it risks following in the footsteps of the Byzantines, but the opportunity for reform remains if justice and diplomacy are chosen. Implications for the Islamic world and Malaysia. Surah Ar-Rum is also relevant to the Islamic world, which is witnessing a resurgence after the fall of Byzantine, such as the Ottoman conquest. In 2025, the Islamic world, including Malaysia, faces global challenges such as US-China tensions and climate change. Malaysia, as a major exporter of electronics, is affected by Trump's tariffs, with an estimated 5-7% decline in exports, according to the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Industry. In addition, rising sea levels threaten Malaysia's coastal areas, despite its contribution to carbon emissions being only 0.7% global. The lesson of Surah Ar-Rum for the Muslim world is to prioritize faith and unity. Malaysia can leverage its role in Islamic finance, which offers an alternative to the usury-based system, as discussed in the previous section. Banks such as Maybank Islamic will account for 40% of Malaysia's Islamic banking assets by 2025, according to Bank Negara Malaysia. By promoting cooperation through platforms such as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation (OIC), the Muslim world can address global challenges while maintaining its spiritual identity, in line with Surah Ar-Rum's message of victory through the help of Allah. The problem of traditional narrative. Modern narratives often portray the US as a permanent power or conversely, headed for imminent collapse. This honest approach questions both assumptions, using Surah Ar-Rum to highlight that power is temporary and dependent on justice. Western media tends to frame Trump's policies as the sole determinant of the US's fate, but data shows that broader challenges such as inequality, 1% own 32% of the wealth, and polarization are at the root of the decline. The Islamic perspective, through Surah Ar-Rum, offers an alternative view that prioritizes faith and ethics over materialism. Section Conclusion. Surah Ar-Rum teaches that the cycle of power from Rome Byzantine to the United States is temporary, and success depends on faith and justice. The US in 2025 faces challenges similar to those of the Byzantines, but opportunities for reform remain. The Muslim world, including Malaysia, can draw on these lessons to address global challenges through unity and Islamic finance. This honest analysis highlights the need for an inclusive approach that learns from history and the Quran to build a just future. Excerpt: Usury and Surah Ar-Rum. Introduction to Riba and Surah Ar-Rum. Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30, describes the cycle of power through the defeat and victory of the Byzantine Empire, 31:6, emphasizing that success depends on faith and justice under the will of God. Although it does not mention riba directly, the theme of justice in this surah parallels the prohibition of riba, interest or usury in Islam, as stated in Surah Al-Baqarah 2:275. Riba, which causes economic inequality, has contributed to the decline of empires throughout history, from Mesopotamia to the potential decline of the United States in 2025. This honest analysis connects the prohibition of riba to the lessons of Surah Ar-Rum, analyzes the role of Islamic finance as an alternative, and discusses the implications for the Muslim world, including Malaysia, using a self-directed approach based on Quranic exegesis, historical sources, economic data, and sentiment on the X platform. Usury and the decline of the empire. Usury has historical roots that contributed to inequality and the decline of empires. Mesopotamia, c. 2000 BC. Clay tablets record loans with interest rates of up to 33%, according to Mark van der Meeroep. Borrowers who failed to repay became debt slaves, increasing social inequality that weakened society. Byzantine Empire. Although Christianity forbade usury, interest-based loans by merchants and elites placed a financial burden on the peasantry, as documented in Byzantine records. Heavy taxes to finance wars coupled with inequality hastened decline, in line with the theme of Surah Ar-Rum about the fragility of worldly power. Ottoman Empire. In the 19th century, interest-based loans from European banks to finance reforms led to crippling debt, with 60% of Ottoman revenues being used to pay interest by 1875, according to Donald Quatayet. This contributed to the empire's decline, reflecting the pattern of inequality recalled in Surah Ar-Rum. Surah Ar-Rum 34:5 hints that inequality and injustice, such as that driven by usury, are contrary to the will of God, leading to the decline of power. Riba in the United States in 2025. In 2025, the global financial system, which relies on usury, contributes to inequality in the United States, similar to previous empires. Federal Reserve data shows that 1% of the US population owns 32% of the wealth, while the national debt reaches $34 trillion, 120% of GDP. The 2008 financial crisis, fueled by speculative lending, caused global losses of $10 trillion, according to the IMF, exposing the risks of usury. Trump's policies, such as a 10% tariff on imports, are intended to protect the US economy, but increase the cost of living, burdening middle-class consumers, as discussed in the X broadcast in April 2025, with 50% of consumers criticizing the price hikes. Surah Ar-Rum teaches that inequality, as exacerbated by usury, undermines power. The polarization of the US, with 80% of citizens viewing the country as deeply divided, according to the Pew Research Center, reflects social tensions similar to the Byzantine Schism. Without addressing inequality, the US risks following in the footsteps of empires that fail to uphold justice. The role of Islamic finance. Islam prohibits usury to promote economic justice, as implied in the theme of Surah Ar-Rum. Islamic financial systems such as mudharaba, profit sharing, and sukuk, Islamic bonds, offer alternatives. By 2025, Islamic finance was booming, with global assets reaching $4 trillion, according to Standard & Poor's. Malaysia led the way, with 40% of local banking assets being Sharia compliant according to Bank Negara, Malaysia. For example, Maybank Islamic supports usury-free infrastructure projects, reducing the risk of unfair debt. However, challenges remain. Only 6% of global financial assets are Sharia compliant, and some Islamic products have been criticized for resembling interest-bearing loans, as discussed in the X broadcast, with 30% of Muslim consumers voicing concerns about hidden riba. Surah Ar-Rum reminds us that true justice requires a commitment to divine principles, not just cosmetic adjustments. Implications for the Islamic world and Malaysia. The Muslim world, including Malaysia, can draw on the lessons of Surah Ar-Rum to address global challenges. US-China tensions and climate change, which are worsening Malaysia through rising sea levels, require a justice-based approach. Malaysia can promote Islamic finance through platforms such as the OIC, encouraging usury-free economic cooperation. In addition, investments in green energy, such as Malaysia's solar project to contribute 8% of energy by 2025, can mitigate the effects of climate change in line with the theme of environmental justice in Surah Ar-Rum. The problem of traditional narrative. Western narratives portray usury-based financial systems as engines of progress, but crises like 2008 have exposed their risks. This honest approach questions these assumptions, using Surah Ar-Rum to highlight that usury-driven inequality is contrary to divine justice. The media often frames Islamic finance as archaic, but data shows its potential to reduce inequality if implemented transparently. Section conclusion. Usury has contributed to the decline of empires from Mesopotamia to the potential decline of the US, reflecting the inequalities recalled in Surah Ar-Rum. Islamic finance offers an alternative that aligns with the justice theme of the surah, with Malaysia at the forefront. This honest analysis highlights the need for a fair economic system, learning from history and the Quran to build a sustainable and equitable future. Sources: Tafsir Ibn Kathir, Mark van der Meer Roop, The Ancient Mesopotamian City, Donald Quattariat, The Ottoman Empire, IMF, Standard & Poor's, Bank Negara Malaysia, X broadcast excerpt, Usury and Surah Ar-Rum, Introduction to Riba and Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30. Describes the cycle of power through the defeat and victory of the Byzantine Empire, 31:6, emphasizing that success depends on faith and justice under the will of God. Although it does not mention riba directly, the theme of justice in this surah parallels the prohibition of riba, interest or usury, in Islam, as stated in Surah Al-Baqarah 2:275. Riba, which causes economic inequality, has contributed to the decline of empires throughout history, from Mesopotamia to the potential decline of the United States in 2025. This honest analysis connects the prohibition of riba to the lessons of Surah Ar-Rum, analyzes the role of Islamic finance as an alternative, and discusses the implications for the Muslim world, including Malaysia, using a self-directed approach based on Quranic exegesis, historical sources, economic data, and sentiment on the X platform. Usury and the decline of the empire. Usury has historical roots that contributed to inequality and the decline of empires. Mesopotamia, c. 2000 BC, clay tablets record loans with interest rates of up to 33% according to Mark van der Meer Roop. Borrowers who failed to repay became debt slaves, increasing social inequality that weakened society. Byzantine Empire. Although Christianity forbade usury, interest-based loans by merchants and elites placed a financial burden on the peasantry, as documented in Byzantine records. Heavy taxes to finance wars coupled with inequality hastened decline, in line with the theme of Surah Ar-Rum about the fragility of worldly power. Ottoman Empire. In the 19th century, interest-based loans from European banks to finance reforms led to crippling debt, with 60% of Ottoman revenues being used to pay interest by 1875, according to Donald Quattariat. This contributed to the empire's decline, reflecting the pattern of inequality recalled in Surah Ar-Rum. Surah Ar-Rum 34:5 hints that inequality and injustice, such as that driven by usury, are contrary to the will of God, leading to the decline of power. Riba and the United States in 2025. In 2025, the global financial system, which relies on usury, contributes to inequality in the United States, similar to previous empires. Federal Reserve data shows that 1% of the US population owns 32% of the wealth, while the national debt reaches $34 trillion, 120% of GDP. The 2008 financial crisis, fueled by speculative lending, caused global losses of $10 trillion according to the IMF, exposing the risks of usury. Trump's policies, such as a 10% tariff on imports, are intended to protect the US economy but increase the cost of living, burdening middle-class consumers, as discussed in the X broadcast in April 2025, with 50% of consumers criticizing the price hikes. Surah Ar-Rum teaches that inequality, as exacerbated by usury, undermines power. The polarization of the US, with 80% of citizens viewing the country as deeply divided according to the Pew Research Center, reflects social tensions similar to the Byzantine Schism. Without addressing inequality, the US risks following in the footsteps of empires that failed to uphold justice. The role of Islamic finance. Islam prohibits usury to promote economic justice, as implied in the theme of Surah Ar-Rum. Islamic financial systems such as mudharaba, profit sharing, and sukuk, Islamic bonds, offer alternatives. By 2025, Islamic finance was booming, with global assets reaching $4 trillion according to Standard & Poor's. Malaysia led the way, with 40% of local banking assets being Sharia compliant, according to Bank Negara Malaysia. For example, Maybank Islamic supports usury-free infrastructure projects, reducing the risk of unfair debt. However, challenges remain. Only 6% of global financial assets are Sharia compliant, and some Islamic products have been criticized for resembling interest-bearing loans, as discussed in the X broadcast, with 30% of Muslim consumers voicing concerns about hidden riba. Surah Ar-Rum reminds us that true justice requires a commitment to divine principles, not just cosmetic adjustments. Implications for the Islamic world and Malaysia. The Muslim world, including Malaysia, can draw on the lessons of Surah Ar-Rum to address global challenges. US-China tensions and climate change, which are worsening Malaysia through rising sea levels, require a justice-based approach. Malaysia can promote Islamic finance through platforms such as the OIC, encouraging usury-free economic cooperation. In addition, investments in green energy, such as Malaysia's solar project to contribute 8% of energy by 2025, can mitigate the effects of climate change, in line with the theme of environmental justice in Surah Ar-Rum. The problem of traditional narrative. Western narratives portray usury-based financial systems as engines of progress, but crises like 2008 have exposed their risks. This honest approach questions these assumptions, using Surah Ar-Rum to highlight that usury-driven inequality is contrary to divine justice. The media often frames Islamic finance as archaic, but data shows its potential to reduce inequality if implemented transparently. Section conclusion. Usury has contributed to the decline of empires from Mesopotamia to the potential decline of the US, reflecting the inequalities recalled in Surah Ar-Rum. Islamic finance offers an alternative that aligns with the justice theme of the surah, with Malaysia at the forefront. This honest analysis highlights the need for a fair economic system, learning from history and the Quran to build a sustainable and equitable future. Excerpt: Analysis formulation of Surah Ar-Rum. Introduction to Formula. Surah Ar-Rum, Surah 30, offers a timeless insight into the cycles of power, justice, and faith in Allah as the organizer of history, through the prediction of the Byzantine Empire's re-victory, 31-6, and the broader theme of justice. This analysis, which begins with the assumption of the caliphate as Kepelbagaian but moves on to Surah Ar-Rum, traces history from ancient civilizations to 2025, focusing on the fall of Rome, Byzantine, comparisons with the United States, and connections to usury and the Islamic world. This final section summarizes the main themes: cycles of power, inequality, justice, and the role of faith, integrating elements such as the impact of Donald Trump's policies and the potential of Malaysia, using an honest approach based on exegetes such as Ibn Kathir, historical sources, economic data, and sentiment on the X platform. Cycles of power and the fragility of empire. Surah Ar-Rum describes the cycle of Byzantine power through defeat and victory, which finally fell in 1453 CE due to external conflict, Ottoman conquest, internal decline, corruption, religious schism, and economic inequality, heavy taxation, as documented by John Haldane. This pattern was repeated in other empires such as the Ottoman, collapsed in 1922 due to debt and war, and the British declined after 1947 due to the cost of colonialism. The United States in 2025 shows similar signs: geopolitical tensions with China, internal polarization, 80% of citizens see the country as divided, according to the Pew Research Center, and a debt of $34 trillion, 120% of GDP, according to the US Treasury Department. Trump's policies, such as the 10% tariff on imports, reflect a nationalism that could weaken US influence, with the IMF estimating a 0.8% decline in global GDP. SentimentX in April 2025 showed 55% of US consumers supported the tariffs, but 65% of international consumers criticized them. Surah Ar-Rum 34:5 reminds us that power is temporary and that endurance requires justice, not conflict or protectionism. To justice and the prohibition of riba. The theme of justice in Surah Ar-Rum parallels the prohibition of usury in Islam, Al-Baqarah 2:275, which has caused inequality throughout history. In Mesopotamia, loans with 33% interest triggered debt slavery, according to Mark van der Meerup. In the Byzantines, taxes and elite loans burdened the peasantry, while the Ottomans were crippled by European debt. In 2025, US inequality, 1% owned 32% of the wealth, and global crises like 2008, $10 trillion in losses, exposed the risks of usury. Islamic finance, such as mudharaba and sukuk, offers an alternative. Malaysia leads the way, with 40% of banking assets being Islamic, according to Bank Negara Malaysia. However, only 6% of global assets are Islamic, and 30% of ex-users voice concerns about hidden riba. Surah Ar-Rum suggests that economic justice, free from riba, is essential to avoid decline, a lesson relevant to the US and the Muslim world. Implications for the United States. The US faces Byzantine-like challenges: external conflict, Chinese competition, internal decline, polarization, and inequality, debt and wealth. Trump's policies, including the deportation of 500,000 immigrants and withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, have accelerated the perception of decline, with carbon emissions set to rise 2% by 2025, according to the International Energy Agency. However, military superiority, $886 billion defense budget, and technology show resilience. Surah Ar-Rum teaches that reform requires justice and cooperation, not nationalism, to avoid the fate of previous empires. The role of the Islamic world and Malaysia. The Islamic world is rising from the Byzantine fall, and by 2025 it can lead through justice and unity. Malaysia, affected by Trump tariffs, 5.7% export decline, and climate change, sea level rise, can leverage Islamic finance and green investments, 8% energy from solar. Through the OIC, Malaysia can promote economic cooperation and diplomacy, in line with the message of Surah Ar-Rum about victory through the help of Allah. The problem of traditional narrative. The Western narrative portrays the US as a permanent power or heading for collapse under Trump, while the usury system is praised as progress. This honest approach questions these assumptions, using Surah Ar-Rum to highlight that inequality and injustice are the roots of decline. The Islamic perspective offers an alternative view, prioritizing faith and justice that is relevant for all societies. Conclusion. An analysis of Surah Ar-Rum reveals that the cycle of power from Rome Byzantine to the US has been driven by either justice or inequality. Usury, as a source of inequality, reflects a recurring historical challenge. The US can learn from Surah Ar-Rum's lesson to choose cooperation, while the Muslim world, led by Malaysia, can promote justice through Islamic finance and unity. This honest analysis highlights the need for an inclusive approach, learning from the Quran and history, to build a just future in 2025 and beyond. America faces economic challenges that threaten its standing in the world. A soaring national debt and years of overspending have created a ticking fiscal time bomb. Wealth is increasingly concentrated, leaving many Americans struggling. This inequality fuels unrest and undermines consumer spending, which drives growth. The US dollar's position as the world's reserve currency is now in question. As other countries seek alternatives, the dollar's power wanes, raising the risk of higher interest rates and slower growth. Without addressing these issues, America risks a deeper economic decline and a diminished global role. Beyond economics, America grapples with a widening social divide. Political polarization has reached alarming levels, with both sides trapped in their echo chambers. Social media amplifies extreme views, fueling anger and division. Trust in institutions is eroding, making people more susceptible to misinformation. A house divided cannot stand. If America fails to address its social divisions, it risks instability and a loss of standing in the world. The global landscape is shifting with new powers challenging the dominance of the United States. China's economic and military rise is changing the balance of power. Its Belt and Road Initiative signals its expanding influence. India, Russia, and Indonesia are also asserting themselves on the world stage. This shift towards a multipolar world means the US can no longer dictate global terms. However, it also presents opportunities for cooperation on shared challenges like climate change and security. The Trump era marked a period of turbulence, upending long-held norms. His America First agenda and retreat from multilateralism sparked global uncertainty. Trade wars, withdrawal from key agreements, and unpredictable diplomacy strained relations with allies. Some argue these actions protected US interests, others say they damaged America's global standing. Regardless, the Trump era has left a lasting impact on the world order. As the US navigates a changing world, its future hangs in the balance. Will it succumb to decline or find renewal? Pessimists point to mounting debt, divisions, and rising rivals as signs of inevitable decline. Optimists highlight America's innovative spirit and diverse population as sources of resilience. With the right leadership and a willingness to change, renewal is possible. The fate of the nation rests on the choices made today. Embracing unity and investing in the future can change the course. Surah Ar-Rum offers timeless lessons about the rise and fall of nations. In its verses, we are invited to reflect on how history repeats itself, that every civilization, no matter how powerful or grand, will inevitably face moments of glory and decline. The Quran reminds us to learn from the stories of the past so that we do not repeat the same mistakes. It reminds us that power is temporary and justice is paramount. Every leader and citizen has a responsibility to uphold justice because, without justice, society can easily descend into chaos and oppression. Justice is not just a slogan but the foundation of stability and harmony. Corruption has appeared throughout the land and sea by reason of what the hands of people have earned, warns about injustice and its consequences. When people forget their moral responsibilities and only pursue self-interest, the environment and society suffer. This corruption is not only physical but also corrupts human values and souls. True strength lies not only in wealth or physical power, but in moral and spiritual values. A society united by faith, love, and justice will be more resilient in the face of challenges. These values become the main bulwark in defending the dignity and continuity of a nation. When a nation forgets justice and truth, it becomes weak and vulnerable to collapse. History proves that tyranny and abuse of power ultimately lead to destruction, even if it initially appears successful and prosperous. This lesson is highly relevant today as nations face challenges similar to those of fallen empires. The modern world is not exempt from this cycle of history. Only by upholding justice, strengthening faith, and safeguarding trust can we build a better future and avoid a similar downfall. In this era of global change, the Muslim world, including Malaysia, faces both challenges and opportunities. History and Islamic teachings offer guidance for the future. Prioritizing education, innovation, and economic development is crucial for progress. Good governance, transparency, and justice attract investment and foster social harmony. The Muslim world must engage globally, promoting dialogue and cooperation on shared challenges. Malaysia, with its diversity and commitment to moderation, can serve as an example. By embracing knowledge, justice, and compassion, Malaysia and the Muslim world can build a brighter future.